Good evening and welcome. My name is Chase Robinson. I'm president of the Graduate Center, and I am delighted that you're here tonight for this conversation with Governor Jerry Brown of California. Public programs like this one are vital to our mission as a public institution devoted to advanced research and learning. Our fall season of events brings many notables to our stage, from Janet Yellen to Roxane Gay, and also in-depth conversations on topics from artificial intelligence to the importance of the census. The Graduate Center, as some of you will know, is one of the largest PhD granting institutions in the country, and we are especially proud that we rank among the country's top 10 institutions in the number of doctorates we award to underrepresented minority students. With our expanding catalog of master's programs and nearly 40 centers and institutes that focus on critical issues from education to inequality, we practice our conviction that research, open debate, and facts are essential to the functioning of democracy. Among our many institutes and centers is the Levy Center for Biography, our co-host for tonight. The Levy Center is a hub for biographers, nurturing their work with resident fellowships, providing doctoral students with dissertation fellowship funding, and offering coursework to our master's students, and soon we anticipate a full master's degree in biography and memoir. The center also sponsors events like this, bringing writers and the newsworthy and riveting people they write about to share their ideas and experiences. Joining the conversation tonight is Kai Bird, the executive director of the center and a renowned biographer. He co-authored the Pulitzer Prize-winning study of J. Robert Oppenheimer, American Prometheus, and he's the author of The Good Spy, about CIA operative Robert Ames, and also a memoir of growing up in the Middle East. He's currently at work on a book about the White House years of President Jimmy Carter. I'm also very pleased to welcome to our stage Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer Miriam Pawel. She was a reporter and editor for Newsday and the Los Angeles Times, and is now the award-winning author of 3 books that chronicle the history of California through biographies of some of its most compelling residents. A collective biography capturing the farm worker movement, and a revealing and nuanced study of the organizer of the Farm Workers Union, Cesar Chavez. Her latest book, which is just out, is The Browns of California. It's a sweeping history of the state told through the stories of 4 generations of the Brown family. Reviewers are praising the book as engrossing and exquisitely researched, with a narrative that functions as deep art. The New York Times Book Review lauded Pawel for a history that illuminates, quote, the sea change in the nation's politics in the last half of the 20th century. I am honored to welcome California Governor Jerry Brown to our stage. Governor Brown has committed his life to public service. The trajectory of his political life offers us insight into the history of California politics. First elected governor in 1975, he also served as the mayor of Oakland and was re-elected as governor in 2010. He is now completing his 4th term as governor. Governor Brown's candor and activism on a multitude of issues, as a recent New York Times article put it, earn him criticism from all sides. But his fierce commitment to the people of the state, and especially to combating climate change, have made him a visionary leader. When his father, Edmund G. Pat Brown, was governor in the late 50s and 60s, Among his accomplishments was the creation of the master plan that expanded California's great public university system. And tonight, here we are at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York City's great public university, indeed the nation's largest public urban university system. We are the only stop for the governor on this book tour. So, time for all of us to enter into the conversation, to hear compelling history, political insight, personal recollection, perhaps a little bit of gossip, indeed the elements of any great biography. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished guests.
Good evening. Can you all hear me? We promote biography at the Levy Center for Biography, and we have authors with their new biographies routinely. But this is a most unusual event in that we this time have the biographer with his subject, with her subject. And that's a real pleasure, and I think we're going to have an interesting conversation. I want to mention also that Miriam Pawel is also the daughter of a famous biographer, Ernst Pawel, who wrote a celebrated biography of Franz Kafka back in the 80s, I believe. So she's following in the footsteps of her father. Anyway, Governor Brown and Miriam, welcome. As a biographer myself, I happen to believe that this is a genre that is absolutely the best vehicle for conveying the complexity of human history. And I'm going to get the conversation going by asking the first question, but we're then going to have a conversation between the biographer and her subject. And occasionally I may jump in if I think the conversation is lagging. So right off, I want to ask a rather delicate question. I've written biographies of both the living and the dead. And I have to say that while there are advantages to having a living subject, well, you know, sometimes the living cause problems. And so it's easier to do the dead. So I want to ask you, Miriam, if there were any obstacles the governor placed in your path as the biographer. And I want to ask the governor if you have any regrets about this book as written by Miriam. Or, if it had been a memoir, what would there be in the book that was not in Miriam's book? Miriam, you're up first.
So, first of all, I want to just point out that I too followed in my father's footsteps. So that, you know, is a common thread right. That I had not thought of before. You know, I think the biggest obstacle that you put in my path was your determination not to put things in writing when you were in office the first time around. And therefore, it was extra hard for me to find things in the archives, although I worked hard to do that. But honestly, in terms of obstacles of the sort that you're talking about, no. I mean, it was rather extraordinary. I used to cover Mario Cuomo, and I cannot imagine having written a piece about Mario Cuomo without having an enormous number of obstacles, so.
First of all, what I would put in the biography that I would write, you will have to wait and read it when and if it gets written. So they're just different. An autobiography is, well, I can't say what it is because it doesn't exist, but I would presume it would be, it'd be a first-person reflection. It'll have its own distortions and candor that would be different, that's all. But stay tuned.
So are you thinking of doing a memoir?
Thinking about it a little bit. But I have so many other things to think about right now.
And I mean, I would add that,
What?
you said to me on several occasions that you do not like embellishment.
I don't,
And-
embellishment. Well, embellishment, yeah, it sounds like exaggeration or gilding the lily, distorting, as opposed to crystalline clarity, or as Camus once said, polar lucidity. I think you said that.
And that, I mean, that's what made you a very unusual subject in terms of writing about someone who is living, because most living subjects that I have written about as a journalist or biographer to some extent create their own stories, and particularly politicians like to create their own legends, and you go the other direction. So you were actually very helpful to me in knocking down some of the legends that your father, for example, had perpetuated.
Oh, what did you say, he perpetuated?
Yeah.
About himself?
Yeah, just sort of story. I mean, I recall some conversations of asking you whether
Well,
certain things were
we
true.
were at different times. I mean, I did come into politics at a period when the anti-heroic was more plausible. It was a time when, and we're still living in that time, where things are breaking down. We're in a postmodernist, deconstructive kind of world with the loss in Vietnam and the Watergate disillusion, the assassination of President Kennedy. These, at least when I was growing up, seemed very major breakdowns. And so the typical narrative, and also if you were to think of how I certainly encountered my first presidential story was, of course, George Washington when he chopped down the cherry tree and he couldn't tell a lie. Well, that kind of tells you how far we've come. So yes, I think embellishment needs to be used judiciously. But I can't say that I don't create my own story. I mean, I certainly do that. And part of that, so we can't avoid that. We're not unconscious walking through a simple world. It's media rich. It's full of contradictory impulses, perceptions, and understandings. And to be successful in that world, you do need some consistency, and you need a story that people can relate to. So every politician, if he or she is going to be successful, does do some crafting of the story.
I wanted to ask you about your attachment to history, because, I mean, this biography is my attempt, in part, to tell a history of California, and I sort of got that idea in part from a conversation with you where you talked about the importance of history as an anchor in times of disruption. I think when you were inaugurated in 2015, your wife said in introducing you that no one she knew was guided more by history in terms of principles and looking to the past for guidance. And I just wanted to see if you would talk about that a little bit, because I think people associate you with someone who's very forward-looking, and certainly you're in the news a lot in terms of climate change, and that's an issue where you are very much pushing everyone to look forward. So where does the history part and the looking back come in? Why is that important?
Well, someone wrote what I think was a fairly important book called The Need for Roots. I assume everyone has read that, by Simone Weil, a French writer, a very interesting woman, Jewish woman who embraced Christianity but refused to be baptized and worked with factory workers to experience during World War II what factory workers felt. Anyway, this idea of roots, being grounded, that idea becomes more salient the older I get and the more change I perceive. The world, just coming of age or growing up in the world of Pius XII, Roman Catholicism, where lots of nuns and priests and everyone that I knew who was a Catholic went to Mass on Sunday. It's in Latin. The last prayer in the Mass is prayer for the conversion of Russia. That's all good. That was the last prayer before you walked out. So anyway, that all has changed. In the 50s, San Francisco had a Republican mayor. California had a Republican governor. Pot was not legal. It was viewed as reefer madness, I guess. There's no concept of gay rights. It's just a different, I can remember as a young boy, someone across the street telling me, well, they dropped the atomic bomb. I said, what's that? There's been a sea change. It's all these different changes, which I guess is normal. Older people want to hold back because of the flood of changes. In fact, I find many of my contemporaries don't use smartphones. I find that very annoying when I want to email them. Of course, as governor, I have a vast army of people and technicians and helpers so that I get my smartphone programmed, and actually I have a very smart wife that can do this too. So, but there is a certain, there's an experience of change. When my father ran, the first campaign I remember was 1943. I was 5. I was born in 1938. And he was running for district attorney of San Francisco. And there was live radio. And there were little cards that people handed out. And then he ran for attorney general. In 1946, he lost, and in 1950, there was no television. Newspaper endorsements were crucial, labor unions. My father was quite a joiner. He joined the Elks Club, the Moose, the Knights of Columbus. I can't remember all of them, but he was a young lawyer. That's how you got business. Well, those clubs barely exist anymore. So there was an organizing of our, when you go into small towns, you see the ancient, the Oddfellows Lodge, or they had the Ancient Order of the Hibernians. These are all gone, or if they're not gone, they're just a shadow of what they once were. So we're this media, Twitter, rapid change, the assertion of so many different rights that were not even thought of as needs, let alone rights, just a few decades ago. So that rapidity of change makes the more solid aspects of life feel more important. And so as I got older and I noticed the actual rootedness that I actually had in California. My grandmother was born in 1878, and she grew up 100 yards from where I've just finished completing a house, which I call the Mountain House. And she grew up in another mountain house on the same location, and she used to tell me about it. And her father, who never spoke English, he was a German. I'd heard about him, but I didn't hear very much about him. Thanks to Miriam, we learned more as part of that pursuit. I learned he came from a small town, Wüsten, in Germany. His father was an innkeeper, and he left Hamburg in 1849 on a ship called Perseverance. I've only learned that in more recent times. But I always remember in grammar school, at the St. Brendan School, the nuns would always tell us, persevere, perseverance. He who perseveres is saved. So this notion of stick-to-itness and also a rootedness in the verities. I had a very good friend, and I wasn't a teacher formally, but he was a person I came to know and respect, Gregory Bateson, who talked about the university as becoming, having no real fundamental ideas, that it's more of buzz bits of information. And he said what the university should be about is the eternal verities. Now, you couldn't even talk about the eternal verities anymore, I wouldn't think. But the notion that there is a perennial wisdom, that there are enduring truths, patterns, customs in the midst of all the change, I think that's really where I've taken an interest. And I've also started to study California history. I didn't know, we didn't know much about California history. I know a fair amount since, 1943 or 4 when I started noticing things. But California had a very rich history, and when I was growing up, I just thought of like cowboys and Indians. And I remember when I was very young, I was in the Sierras with my family. I know it was my 5th birthday because that's the year I learned how to swim. And we went into a restaurant, and they said, they had a little sign that said, "No Indians allowed." So that was 1943. So then as I came to get more understanding about the Indian genocides and massacres, in fact, just last week, one of the local historical society, a woman sent me a note, I don't think you caught this, about the massacre at the Red Gate. And the Red Gate is right in front of the Mountain House where my grandmother grew up. So I think we need to look back and then look forward. And so I find the past is instructive. And for whatever reason, maybe it's my age or whatever, I'm taking the past more seriously as a picture of the future. And what was could be again. And when we think of living in the shadow of this, which nobody's thinking about tonight, but I'll rub your nose in it a little bit. We have 7,000 nuclear warheads, so do the Russians, and more than 1,000 each on both sides can be launched in less than 2 hours and can kill 100 million people, no problem. Well, that's unthinkable. But I think back to the native peoples that lived for 12,000 years, and it was unthinkable that these people from Europe were going to show up, and through the diseases, half of them be dead, and then 70 years later, there's a gold rush, and almost the rest of the other half were wiped out. Well, for 12,000 years, I imagine, even where my ranch is, when I walk through the mountains and think about that, these people, because we have arrowheads, there were villages on the place where my grandmother grew up and where I'm now going to live. The world changes suddenly. Well, our world can change, and we're not removed from the catastrophic consequences that human history embodies. In fact, I just looked at someone, I don't know where I came up with it, but someone wrote a book on collapse of civilization. Not a book, it was a memo or a paper by an archaeologist from Harvard. What it was a study of starting with the warming of the climate in approximately 11 or 12,000 BC. And it was the history of climate changes, famines, droughts, migrations, new weapons, new means of transportation, and crazy and incompetent rulers. And this series goes from 12,000, he takes it right up to the warming period in the Middle Ages. And these different periods of climate change that coincide with catastrophically disruptive events. And so now that's the broad picture, from where it's California, the world, Middle East, how humankind going along for 50 years, 100 years, 1,000 years, thousands of years, all of a sudden an interruption of a quite apocalyptic nature. So I think it behooves us to look to the past, even as we open ourselves to change, to surprise, to what hasn't been, and what might be. So I think, and I also was listening to a panel at the World Economic Forum just before I came here, and they were all, the 5 panelists were talking about education as the key, and they were saying how important technology and coding was, And they were saying how things are changing so fast. We have to change our education so fast. And that may be true about coding, but it's not true about literature. It's not true about philosophy. It's not true about the stories of humankind that are written in our history, our literature, our philosophy. So
So you're
I
talking
think
about the
that connection-
verite,
what?
the essential truth of place. When you talk about going back to your mountain house, you're suddenly realizing the importance of the place, where your roots, where you came from.
Walking in your grandmother's
Well, I
steps.
kind of got it. Wendell Berry talks about place, and Gary Snyder, who was a poet in California, and Peter Coyote, he's an actor, but he's also was someone I made the chairman of the California Arts Council when I was governor the first time. He had a troupe. He was part of the Diggers that were in Golden Gate Park, a radical group, a troupe in the 70s. No, I think the late 60s. Anyway, he had a group called the Reinhabitation Theater. And reinhabitation, well, I'd never heard that term before. It's a little clunky, but the idea is first you inhabit, and then someone comes and re-inhabits. So that's you have to have the past for that. And if you have no past, in fact, in totalitarian countries, they often want to eradicate the past. They want to invent their own past. We saw that in many countries where people want to eliminate inconvenient truths. So I think it's key to any kind of wisdom or stability to know the past, even as you deal with all the latest gadgets,
So, Governor,
technology.
what did you learn from
trends. What?
Miriam's book
What?
about your great-grandfather's past that you hadn't known?
Well, I didn't know the name of the ship was called Perseverance. Although Miriam and I were looking into this genealogical material at the same time. I learned. I didn't know my great-grandfather was an innkeeper, and my great-grandfather became an innkeeper himself. And so then I traveled back to Germany.
This
and
is
I saw
August Schuckman.
August Schuckman, and I saw the inn. And I also, because we're in an age of victimization and people are very vulnerable, and when I think of my great-grandfather getting on that ship, coming over to a sailing ship, and then getting over to America, working for a few years, and then taking a covered wagon and showing up in Sacramento in 1852, and then going back. Obviously, he was not into diversity. He wanted a German wife. So he went back, and he got himself, in 1863, and my wife and I went to the little church where they were married in May of 1863, which is right across from where the inn was. So, but it's not just the nostalgia or the turning backward. What does it take to come across the ocean, come across the land, and then go back? And he went around the Cape and came up around the Cape of South America, and then came up to this land where it's often over 100, 110 degrees. There's no air conditioning. There's no well. They got the water from the collecting it on the roof and putting it in a cistern, and there's no electricity. You don't take showers. There's no running water. So these people were tough, and he lived there till he was 80. So I kind of juxtapose that to our cult of comfort, which I certainly am attracted to.
You're kind
myself.
of known to.
What?
You're kind of known to not be attracted to the cult of comfort from your earliest days as governor, for
Well,
sure.
I don't know. Well, because I was in the seminary, and in the Jesuit seminary, pre-Vatican II, I can't say what they do now, but one of the key memes or phrases was agere contra, go against yourself. And the 12th rule of the Jesuits was, let him in all things seek his greater abnegation and continuing mortification. That's a very harsh doctrine. It echoes a little bit from Mao Zedong, who said, fight self, similar to that. So there is a sense that I experienced today, everything is about congratulations, how great this is, how wonderful we are, America's indispensable. It's very contrary to the basic stories that we got. I didn't have helicopter parents. They didn't ask me what I was doing in school. I'd be mortified if my mother showed up.
How did that affect your admin when you became governor in the 70s?
I think I became governor because my parents ignored me. And that created a reaction that I didn't even realize. I was being programmed indirectly to follow directly in my father's footsteps. Had he told me that, of course, I wouldn't have probably done it.
So, Governor, I need to interrupt here.
But it is a different world.
I need to interrupt for a moment to remind people we're passing around note cards for questions, and someone's going to be picking them up so that we can use your questions to address the governor during the Q&A period. I wanted to, speaking of the seminary, I wanted to ask you a question. At one point in Miriam's narrative, she talks about your time in the seminary and your decision to leave. And she then quotes from a document, which I suspect you only read when you read the manuscript.
Yeah, I did. That was a new one.
And the rector's notes, when young Jerry Brown asked to leave the seminary, the rector writes down, frankly, he writes to his colleagues, frankly, I see no hope of saving the young man. And he also noted his manifestations of nonconformance. I think this is telling.
A pretty perceptive guy.
Sure it was a surprise, no?
That's part of the paradox. How does nonconformity come out of complete conformity? Because that's what it was. Well, that's the Hegelian dialectic, if you want a phrase.
How do you think how did your Jesuit education influence how you govern?
How did the Jesuit education? Well, it gives me a certain, a slight inclination toward authoritarianism, just a little bit. I like to blend anarchism and authoritarianism. And because you need order, but you also need chaos.
So
because out of chaos, it comes into the new. In fact, one of my mentors, this Gregory Bateson, he said the new only comes out of the random. He also said, if all you have is imagination, you have insanity. If all you have is order, you have paralytic death. But if you have order and imagination, then you have wisdom. So this dialectic between order and chaos or imagination, between the strictness of the Jesuits, because by the way, you didn't put it in your book, but I will tell you, when I told Father, they call him Big Jack Conley, he's an Irishman, he was the rector at the Sacred Heart Novitiate, and I went into him one day, I said, Father, there's some of these things I'm having a hard time with. I was basically saying, I don't believe some of this stuff. And his response was, we got to get you out of here. And I was out before sundown. So the power of heresy in an authoritarian environment is very powerful. That's why people who want to be dictators don't like a lot of free speech.
This may be part of your storytelling.
What?
That might be part of your storytelling.
That'd be part of my memo.
But that's okay.
What?
I wanted to go back to something you said about sort of on the consumer, on comfort and consumer culture. You were, in your first administration, there is a quote in the book from Rose Bird, one of the many women you put in significant positions, which is an interesting phenomenon as well. But she says, this is not a place to be if you need praise, because Jerry doesn't need praise and he doesn't think anybody else should either. Does that come out of your Jesuit?
If I can give you asked me the early education, another thing the nun said, you have to give God the glory and then you can get the credit in heaven. So this notion that you run around trying to conjure up your own glory is very antithetical to to certain traditions, of which I was introduced to briefly.
not all that briefly,
Well, not briefly.
but at a formative age.
From the 5th grade through college,
Through
yes.
college, yeah.
That's not a light rinse. That's a deep brainwashing. My brain has been very much cleansed,
So let's go back to the
but
women.
corrupted in later years. So
You know, a lot of people who've read the book have commented on the women in your family, starting with your grandmother, Ida Schuckman, and your mother, who was rather a precocious, brilliant student, went to the University of California when she was 14. You had 3 sisters, all strong, smart women as well. How did that, and then you as governor the first time, I mean, I think this is sort of an often forgot aspect of your first administration, is you really changed the complexion of state government by appointing women and minorities to jobs they'd never had in a very conscious way. Do those things tie together?
I don't know that. I mean, I don't know about early experience, but I can tell you, if you have 3 sisters and you're the only boy, what it means is you're on your own. And my father, see, that's why I always thought, how did he get into politics? I only saw my father cook one thing. He cooked a can of mushroom soup, and he had a hard time opening it. I never saw him build anything. I never saw him swing a hammer. I never saw him touch a broom. I was drawn to the life of the mind and the mouth because I didn't learn about the skills of the hands.
He hiked after
He
him.
hiked. Yes, he hiked and he swam a lot. He loved Yosemite. But I think growing up without any brothers, it is more isolating. I was on my own more because the activities were more girl-oriented. So I wasn't a part of that. And in those days, our gender distinctions were pretty
And what about
pretty
your
strict.
What about
Not strict,
your
but
commitment
very
to
definable.
What about your commitment to put women in positions that they'd never
I don't
had?
think it had anything. Well,
Where did
first of
that
all,
come from?
Well, it came from there was a certain, the civil rights movement, the Equal Rights Amendment, the affirmative action. Nixon started that with the Philadelphia Plan. So it was. Remember, I'm coming after Vietnam, after Watergate. A lot of institutional criticism and kind of a collapse. So I'm looking for something different. I mean, there's my father as governor, then Reagan comes in and beats him by 1 million votes with his Reagan cowboy, old John Wayne. And so then it's my turn. So what's that going to look like? Well, I did consciously want to bring in a very, what we call now a diverse group of people, and I did that. And I continue to do that. So that was, with all the talk of the past, I am a disruptive personality, and I do like to change things. And I wanted to change the political culture. That was, in fact, one of the things that I said, which I thought was a brilliant idea at the time, but it sounds banal today. I said what California needs is a new spirit. And people would make fun of me, here comes spirit. But the idea was because of the Watergate, in the Vietnam War, the whole point was if we're losing, more body counts, bombs, napalm. It was more, but the more was the bad. So it was definitely a time to question authority. In fact, that was the slogan, question authority. It was a bumper sticker. So I was looking to do things differently than
Governor,
Reagan or my father.
That causes me to ask you a question. I'm working on a biography of Jimmy Carter.
Yeah.
And I can't resist asking, do you see any similarities between your trajectory and his personal ethics, his environmentalism, his fiscal conservatism? And he was coming up in the same political aftermath of Watergate and all that you were just speaking of. But there's some commonalities.
But I think we're very, very different personalities. and different political. I ran against Jimmy Carter, so
You did.
I did, and I'm not going to recite my criticisms of my campaign speeches, but they were there, and I'm sure you'll find some negative commentary in the Carter materials. But no, think of Gary Hart and his new ideas running against Mondale, the technology, a different view of what the military should have been, environmentalism. There was a time, I think when my father was governor, they didn't even talk, the word environment didn't even show up.
Right.
You had conservation,
Right.
you had conservationists, but you didn't hear about environmentalists. I think that really started with Earth Day. I think that was 1970. The Clean Air Act, 1969. Before that, it was building, freeways, water plans, growth. It was kind of a growth era. So when I came in, questioned growth. The limits to growth by the Club of Rome was I thought, boy, that's interesting. Growth has limits. In fact, when I was governor, I never used the word growth because I associated in one. Now this not entirely, but cancer is growth too. Very rapid growth and very destructive. So there's benign growth, but there's also pathological growth, and we're seeing that in many aspects in the world today. So I got that. The time, it was in the air. We don't show up in a vacuum. We show up in an historic period. And that period was such when the limits to growth was there. Rachel Carson had written Silent Spring. These were the ideas that were circulating. And they may not get expressed in political campaigns, but they're around. And I encountered people like that. And I left the seminary after Big Jack Conley thought I was a nonconformist. I didn't know that. I knew. But anyway, I wanted to have something very different, so I went to Berkeley, and that was January 1960. I lived at the International House, and that was a very that was the completely contrasting experience between being in a seminary of all young men, being totally isolated, no visitors, no media, no television, no books except those by Jesuit authors. It was a very exciting, intellectually stimulating and engrossing path to follow. But then at some point I said, okay, let's try something different. And Berkeley was really different. That I can say that without any question.
I want to get in one quick question before we take the audience.
Yeah.
Because here we are in New York. I'm a New Yorker originally. I can say this because when I lived in New York, I had the New Yorker's view of California. And in part, I wrote this book as a, transplanted Californian to try to explain California to people who don't live there. I mean, there are lots of people there who have learned a lot about their history and need to know that history too. What do you think are you dealt with the East Coast media a lot in your national campaigns and so on. What do you think are the misconceptions that people have about California?
Well, I think New York particularly doesn't understand California. And the media, one thing, the sun is already up for 3 hours before it is in California. So a lot of stuff is happening and we're still asleep. And that creates a gap. And by the way, it always favors candidates from the East Coast. And I have to warn anybody from California, you want to run for president, it's very difficult to take a 5.5-hour flight and get in the game. But what they don't, I don't think, when I was looking out, I was on the 37th floor of some building, I'm not quite sure where, but I look out at all these tall buildings and where's the environment? Where are the trees? Where are the birds? Where are the animals? So when you're in California on the coast, or if you're near the Sierras, or if you're along the redwoods, or you're out in the desert, I think the environment, even if you're not there, the pictures and the ideas of the environment are more with you than they are in the highly urbanized New York. So I feel that that there is a misunderstanding. I don't think, like in the New York Review of Books, I don't think they review poets like Gary Snyder. They're much more Eastern European as opposed to Pacific, Western. That's my impression. Also, even in the review of your book, if I could say,
I agree.
she ended up calling me a neoliberal. Now, but that's a New Yorker's view, or
It was a
they think
Cambridge,
that's
but yes.
California. But I don't even want to get into that neoliberal. But the truth is that California has more government, more regulation, more taxes, more of everything liberal. Now, when you're in the face of that, you have to say no. The whole place will be overgrown or be overrun. So I do try to keep my hand on the tiller and make it more balanced. But I think that idea, maybe the rhetoric or the words or the images, somehow that translated. And when she said neoliberal, I always think that word, by the way, which is pretty esoteric. 99% of the people never heard the word neoliberal. But I have to have read a book by a man named David Harvey, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. David Harvey, he's a geographer, a Marxist geographer, and he wrote a book on neoliberalism. And on the cover, there are 4 pictures. I'm not one of them. There's Ronald Reagan, there's Margaret Thatcher, there's Mao Zedong, there's Deng Xiaoping, and there's Pinochet. And it's about 1978, 1979, which in David Harvey's view was the emergence of neoliberalism. So to add my photograph to those 4, I think misses the point and maybe part of the New York confusion about the nature of California. So I would recommend they actually read this book and maybe read Carey McWilliams' book about California, the Great Exception. So there's a lot of stories. And ever since Mark Twain went out there, people have been telling yarns about California, many of them exaggerated.
So the book is really a biography of a place as well as a family. And you've just spoken about California as, a very remarkable place. Also the 5th largest economy in the world. It's on the cutting edge of high tech. It's on the cutting edge of the environmental movement in this country, setting all the regulatory standards, at least up to this point. And that leads me to ask the first question from the audience that flows right into it. They want to know, how do you feel about the Cal exit proposal to have California secede from the Union and become its own country?
Impractical. Not going to happen.
100 years from
now?
now?
Not a bad idea, actually. 5th largest economy, that wouldn't be bad. No, that's not practical. By the way, I want to say something about place and space. You often hear people today say, I'm working in that space. So space, but contrasted with place, very different. Space is abstract. It's really mathematical, geometric. But place has a human dimension. It has memories. It has smells. And when I go back to the ranch to the mountain house, where my grandmother grew up and my great-grandfather died, it is a place, and the place that I'm building, the ranch, was built by a neighbor from down the road, and he's been working on it for a year and a half. But it's a dwelling, and you dwell in a place, but you're garaged in a space. And a lot of us, one way or the other, are garaged, very standardized, commodified, and so just the ability or the opportunity to be in a place that has memory, that has the shaping by a recognizable hand or person. So place is a very important reality and a very important idea.
It sounds like the mountain house has become very important to you.
Well, the more chaotic things are, the more it's important to be standing somewhere. And standing somewhere that you can locate where you are. I had a chance to meet Marshall McLuhan. wrote the Medium is the Message. He's a classicist from Canada. I put his daughter on the State Board of Education. And so he came up with his wife to meet me, and we talked. I've talked actually several times. But he said, there is no morality at the speed of light. He was given to epigrammatic statements, but as you speed things up, it's a world of flow, random, buzz. Morality is rooted in custom, in repeated practices in a particular location, and that evolves over time. But we're increasingly in a space where anything is possible, where the technology can change anything, and where social engineering is not even thought of as social engineering, but that's just supposedly what we can do and what we do. So I think this idea of speed, yes, there's plenty of speed. The space shuttle, satellites, race cars, trains, planes. So there's a lot of speed, but life happens at a much slower speed. Life as it unfolds at birth and growing up in families and growing old and dying. This happens in a place. And to the extent, even if you're poor or you're rich, it really depends, a place with human beings that you've come to know and depend on, mutually depend, then that's life, that's fundamental. And in the modern world, that becomes somewhat of a luxury as we're thrown into this overpopulated, over-speeded up, highly technologized kind of reality. So that's why I say yes, trying to go through all these traffic jams and sitting there with the noises and the sirens, and the ranch isn't a bad spot. Open, a lot of elbow room. And it kind of reminds me, I don't know that I was influenced, but my mother used to play the piano, and one of my favorite songs was "Don't Fence Me In."
Which is also something that the rector said about you in that letter that you quoted. He said, in other words, his position, there's something where he said, he says that his problem isn't following the rules. It's following the rules because he is told to follow them. In other words, his position is don't fence me in. So
well,
the rector...
in the seminary, we had a practice where there's, how many were in the class? 50 young novices, 18, 19 years old. And once a week, one novice would be called out and have to kneel on the floor, and all the other novices would say what their faults were. And then the master of novices would write down the name and what they said, kind of a summary fault. And I still have my one page. You're not going to get that. But in this, Father Healy was his name. He said, Brother Brown, we call brothers, Brother Brown knows where he's going, but he's going there all by himself. Which in a order is not acceptable, because one of the vices is, besides novelty, which is a vice, singularity. Singularity, wearing something different, looking, they want to have it all into one thing. So I appreciate that. That's an experience. But like everything else, we need the contrary experience, and then you blend it, and you get a synthesis, and that's being alive.
So another question from the audience. As far as I can see, nothing proposed to deal with climate change comes with an order of magnitude that would be effective. So do you agree, and what do you consider the most likely outcome?
Of what? Of humanity?
Of our community, if we don't have
We
a
know
strategy that...
Do we know the outcome? Have you ever read Arnold Toynbee's book on 12 volumes on civilization?
Oh my God, all these books I haven't read.
Well, every civilization that has risen has fallen. Now, we may be the exception. So there is a certain life cycle to most things. But are you saying, will we conquer climate change? I think we can. It's quite incredible to have if you look at the development, human beings were less than 1 billion till maybe 1850. And it all starts with the discovery of coal and oil and gas, and it spikes the population, the technological innovation, comfort, power, electricity, all the steam engine. So we're very much tied in to fossil fuel. We get here powered by oil, and we fly here by oil. So transforming that to zero emissions. And the best science I've seen says we got to get to zero emissions by somewhere 2040, 2050. And then we have to sequester another 1,000 gigatons of CO2. So yeah, that's a big magnitude.
It doesn't sound like it's going to happen.
It can happen, and we do have the technology. What we are lacking is the clarity, and the clarity to see where are we headed, and what do we have to do. But we are solar technology, efficiency, different forms of metal and substance. We have the capacity. There's no question we have the capacity to live with nature. But, for example, if you listen to E.O. Wilson, he'll tell you half the land should be reserved for other species. Now, what are the chances that developers are going to buy into that program? But we do expand our parks, and we make, but so the task is daunting, but that's not to say it can't be done. I think it can be done, but we have to, first of all, we have to acknowledge it. And that question, what we're doing is not of the order of magnitude that the solution requires. And I would definitely agree with that. And in fact, most people couldn't even formulate a question like that. And if we could get that in the US Senate on the floor there to say, hey guys, we got to step it up another order of magnitude, then we're on the right track.
This sort of speaks to your pessimism of the intellect, but optimism of the will philosophy.
Well, that's a facile comment I picked up from somebody.
Yeah, not my facile comment. That was yours.
Oh,
that was a
Mr.
quote.
Well, it came from Gramsci, but
I just
Gramsci,
wanted to get another book in there.
He's the founder. Yes, notebooks, prison notebooks. But he was the founder of the Communist Party in Italy, and he spent his
Tony
last.
Gramsci, right?
Yeah, Antonio Gramsci. He spent most of his he ended up dead. He died in jail. So he definitely had pessimism in the intellect. But he said pessimism in the intellect, optimism of the will. So the energy, animal spirits, the sense of doing, of being called to great deeds. I think those. I'd rather put it this way: you can't see ahead, but you can feel that you can do something. But I don't like to try to think of those big terms because I don't think it's optimism or pessimism. You have to look at things the way they are and see the way things could be, and then try to bring it about.
So another question from the audience. I was hoping to get through this evening without speaking the name of our president. But the question...
The T word.
The T word.
Tweet. T word used to be known as tax.
Right.
Tax, tweet, Trump.
Uh-oh, there it is, Trump. The questioner wants to know, Trump appeals to those who feel passed over and aggrieved. How do you suggest winning this large group of voters over? I guess over to a rational path.
Trump appeals to many of the same people that are being appealed to, in Sweden. The prime minister was just removed after losing a number of seats to the populists. We see the same movement in Spain, the Podemos. I see this in Hungary, Poland. Nationalism is on the move because globalism is about space, and people still feel a need to be rooted. And so
it's fear of immigrants taking their space.
The what?
Fear of immigrants
Well, fear of
refugees
immigrants,
taking
that's
their
fear of
their
change,
space.
fear of difference, fear of the unknown. You have a certain way of life, and all of a sudden, in a decade or two, it looks totally different. So that is threatening. And no matter who you are, if you're very well off and cosmopolitan, your life is pretty secure, you can entertain a lot of diversity. But if you're more stressed, if it's the outcome of things is very unclear and
This is
threatening.
America, the
What?
country of immigrants and
Well, but,
multiculturalism.
Yeah, well, that will show. You're writing biographies on Oppenheimer. That's different than somebody who worked in a automobile factory in Detroit and now is making a fraction of the job or out of the wage or out of work. So there's a lot of disruption, and people want the human beings. We want to hold on. And that's natural. And if we have nothing to hold on to, then we're crazy. It's all just random. So rootedness in nationalism and chauvinism and provincialism, those are very natural things. And what you have to do is to be able to appeal to that. And that's not easy. If you're going to be in West Virginia and say, well, we don't want coal anymore, that's a hard sell. So it may not work for a while, but you have to develop other things, the other forms of energy, other jobs, public works. We had during the Depression, we had the WPA. Other countries build high-speed rail. Teacher corps. There's a lot to be done, but it takes massive public investment, and there's so much skepticism that people aren't ready to do that. Certainly to pay taxes to underwrite it. So yeah, it's. I think it's a normal. Hillary said, "Stronger together." Well, I think some people didn't want to be together, and then Trump came along and said, "We're going to make America great." America is a more generic term, and that is truly an inclusive term. So look, there's always good and bad in different aspects. I mean, the rootedness is something that the Nazis played on. That doesn't mean that a sense of place and a sense of patriotism or a sense of belonging is not vital to human society. But it has its dark side and its abuse. So that we know what that looks like, and but we can't totally ignore it. We can't just, think that everybody's taking jet planes and reading the New York Times. There are a lot of people that don't do that, and their lives.
Everyone lives in Manhattan.
But more people live there than live anywhere else.
What do you think in California? I mean, people think of California as a very blue state, but if you look at the map of California in terms of the counties, as you well know, lots of California actually voted for Trump and is very red. What motivates the Trump supporters in California?
Well, I think they didn't like. I don't think they saw Obama. It didn't look the way they were used to. The Republicans very successfully stigmatized and demonized the Affordable Care Act, made it sound like some horrible thing because they just kept saying it. It's really a big lie technique. And so that became a boogeyman, and the Republicans exploited that, and Trump just took it to a new level. But it doesn't mean, there's still 40% of the people that no matter what Trump does or say, they're willing to embrace that, or at least tolerate it, because they don't like the opposite, which is a change, a diversity that is antithetical to their sense of identity, belonging, and security. So you have to find a way to appeal to that. That's what politicians do. That's what leaders do culturally. I think it can be done. And it is done by some. But right now, the disruptions we see are not limited to the United States. Brexit in England, the movements in Spain, the Five-Star Movement, the Northern League in Italy, the populist movement in Germany. So it's all over the world. It's a function, I don't want to try to summarize it like I could explain it, but this disruption, this rapid acceleration is leaving people in a state of anxiety, and that anxiety is producing a more simplistic view that some people can appeal to very effectively. I think that explains a lot of these very populist movements that are occurring. And the global economy is creating more and more stratification, more and more inequality, more and more environmental disruption, more and more arms sales. So if you look at it, you can paint a pretty dark picture from a left point of view, or even from a parochial populist right point of view. So the middle, it's going to be hard to hold the middle, but that's where wisdom normally resides.
So, Governor, it sounds to me like your intent after you leave office to return to your roots and your mountain house.
At least for some of the day.
But a final question from the audience written down here is, they want to know if you were to run for president, what theme would you strike?
Well, I'm not running for president, so I don't need a theme.
Well, I think it's roots. It's roots.
Well, but roots are not enough. You need innovation too. So, I mean, it's not a one-valued story. Life is, we have a right hand, we have a left hand. We have one side of the hand, and we have the other side. So you have to conjoin the opposites. In fact, there's a great Thomistic phrase which I have always been drawn to, the coincidence of opposites. And you have to blend difference together and in some harmonious greater integration. And that always is what human life turns out to be, and that's what we're having trouble with now, but we know what the path needs to be if we're going to be sustainable and successful.
Okay, well, on that note, I think we've run out of time. Thank you very much. Thank you, Miriam.